Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is Ron Davis, the CEO of Tenacity, and today I'm going to interview Mike Housman. Dr. Housman is a luminary in the space of people analytics, and he's here to help us think a little better about how to measure the effect of our investments when we make investments in our people. He's a thought leader in what keeps people on the job longer and what enables them to perform better. He's published in dozens of peer-reviewed journals and large major public sources like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, and the Atlantic. In fact, in 2014, he was named a game changer by Workforce Magazine for his research. Dr. Housman has his master's and PhD in applied economics and managerial science from Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania, and started off getting his bachelor's at Harvard University. Thanks, Mike, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Ron, for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's my pleasure. So as I said, I've invited you to come share some insights with our audience. So I want to start with this, which is call centers have tons of data and really not a lot of tools for using it, right? They've got all these analytical tools, but really analytical tools just means here's a spreadsheet with a bunch of information. I'm hoping you can help us get better at that. So why don't you start off by telling us what got you interested in workforce analytics?
Yeah, and it's a fascinating topic, and we'll get to the reporting and BI tools, but I got interested in workforce analytics partially in studying grad school. I'd studied a lot of organizational behavior and culture, focusing specifically on healthcare organizations and looking at how when people work well together and they get along and there's a culture of psychological safety, fewer bad things happen, medication errors, wrong site surgeries, really bad stuff.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's very concrete impact on whether people live or die. That said, I wanted to take a step aside from healthcare and say, well, what about non-healthcare settings? What about, your average office-based setting? What about a call center? So I joined forces with Max Simkov at Evolve and helped build out the data science function there. And we're really focused on applying predictive analytics to workforce decisions, especially hiring decisions, to help people, to help organizations hire the right people under the theory that if you hire the right person, you train them properly, you manage them appropriately, you get so much more out of them and be more enriching engagement and relationship on both sides of the equation.
And I assume the data bore that out?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We've done a ton of research that finds, I was always, for me, the biggest surprise was I came in thinking, it's all about the raw talent. If you get the right person in the door, everything takes care of themselves. And so that decision, who to hire, is the most important. And I walked away from Evolve saying completely the opposite. It's not necessarily, it's some of who you hire, but it's who they work with, first and foremost. It's who they work for. It's how you engage them. It's what sort of things they're going through in that course of that workforce, that employee experience, wellness programs and things like that. It's the culture. All of those things statistically matter a lot more than just who it is that walks in the door. And so it realigned my perceptions, and it makes a lot of sense. Solutions like Tenacity are really focused on those later stages of the employee life cycle and not just on let's evaluate someone's resume in a more effective way.
Yeah. It's funny. Because we do work on that later cycle, I actually often get asked, what about hiring? And I always say, actually, there's this great tool out there called Evolve, and tell them who it's and all that kind of stuff. But so as you know, and as you alluded, our company works with call centers too. So we found that most of our buyers are, smart smart people who work with data all day, but have no what I would call formal statistical training. They're intelligent enough to be skeptical about claims that people make. Oh, this will do that. This will produce an ROI. But they don't actually have a lot of tools for actually identifying cause and effect in their data. So they're walking around with these reams of spreadsheets and data everywhere, but they're kind of lost in it. They can't really use it very well. So to give you an example, one thing we see a lot is people using what I call before and after measurements, right? Say you want to test a CSAT improvement class. Hey, is the CSAT improvement class going to help improve CSAT? So they might start the program in January and see if their CSAT scores improve. And they assume, hey, it went up, so the program helped. Can you tell me if that's a problem, why that might be a problem?
Yeah, so first off, it's good to be at least thinking in a before and after type of way. So at least tracking changes longitudinally is a step up from thinking about it cross-sectionally. That means we're thinking about how it's changing over time. So it's not all bad. However, there are some problems when you start to make inferences over time. And one of those problems may be that the adoption of some sort of class or implementation of some change may coincide with other things that are going on within that employee, that call center, right? We may have adopted another program around the same time. We may have hired people that are very focused on improving CSAT, right? We may even have really weather going on at that period of time when we happen to implement that program. And all of those things, unfortunately, influence CSAT. And as a result, it makes it really hard to make a causal claim about what was the specific impact of that class.
So if I roll it out in January and my scores are up in February, I don't know if the class is why they're up.
Exactly. It doesn't necessarily refute what you're saying. If you see the scores go up, it's entirely possible the class was partially attributable to that. But the actual impact of the class could be greater or less than what you're actually seeing in the data.
You just don't know, basically.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, what about benchmarking? I see before and after the most, right? We changed the size of the cubicles, and now average handle times are different. So cubicles fix handle time, and I always kind of ask the questions. I like the weather example. Are you sure it wasn't the weather? Did the weather change? Which is basically we don't know, right? What pushes all these outcomes up or down? But what about benchmarking? So say you put the CSAT class in Tempe, and you've got a similar center, answering the same kind of calls in Jacksonville, and you compare the effect. Maybe the CSAT score goes up a little bit in Tempe. What would that tell you? Did the CSAT score class improve scores or not?
I hate to say that the answer is, again, it's maybe, right? So the good news about doing benchmarking and comparing one center to another is now we're actually starting to get at some of the things that might have driven both centers up or down at the same time, right? Think about corporate initiatives, or maybe we just had performance reviews, or maybe there's something that's going on in corporate that's impacting both offices, right? They happen to also decide that they were going to offer free lunches on Tuesday in both, whatever the case may be. So now we're actually, because we're looking at the two centers in comparison to one another, we're eliminating the impact of things that are occurring concurrently in both of those offices.
Okay.
But there's still probably things going on different in Tempe than there are in, what was the other location? Jacksonville.
Mississippi.
Yeah. So they're in two different locations. Once again, the weather could have an impact. There could be a different set of policies in Tempe that there are in Jacksonville. So it at least helps us get at some of those. Remember, if there's all sorts of stuff that can have an impact, now we're taking stuff off the table, but we haven't really isolated the true impact of that class.
Yeah, as you say that, I think about back to something you said earlier, which is that people matter so much. You have different managers, right, on the ground in Tempe and Jacksonville too, right? Or they may have turned over or something like that. So you could have very different group dynamics, different cultures. Yeah, there are things, even if it's from the same company, answering the same calls, it could be different. That's helpful. And actually, we see this in BPOs. I hadn't thought of this, but a lot of BPOs have a lot of legacy systems, right, because they've bought up other companies. So they're actually often using different technology to answer the same calls. Okay, that's helpful. So it's rough too, though, right? So if you can't do before and after, and you can't do benchmarking, you've pretty much eliminated the usual toolbox. Do you need a doctoral degree in statistics from Princeton to figure this out?
So the good news is you don't. There are still some tricks and tools that are left that can help us get at that notion of, like, what's the true impact of this CSAT class.
Okay.
And some of them involve, let's say we focus on one center, right? So we're not looking at differences across centers. And let's look at the same pool of employees that are walking in the same door every day and sitting in different cubicles, but within the same general location and office place. And we can start to potentially design what I would call an A/B test, right? Which is an experiment, right? The gold standard in the sciences is a randomized controlled experiment where I randomly assign subjects to either a control group or a treatment group. The problem when you're talking about the workforce is you can't do that very easily because people talk, right? You can't just say, okay, I always tell people when we're trying to figure out the impact of different wages on someone's performance, You can't assign randomly half the population of working employees and say, okay, you get a $5 raise, you don't get a raise.
Yeah.
The two are going to talk to one another, and people
Anarchy.
are not going to be talking. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the same is true here. Look, unfortunately, because we can't do this in experiment, we can't be, treating employees like we would rats in a laboratory. We can still design as close as possible what I would consider an A/B test,
Okay.
which is making an intervention available to those employees, right? And hopefully you're going to see different adoption rates. In an ideal world, you would prescribe to one group that they, do this, and that the other group that they don't. But that's a challenge. But ultimately, what you want to do is have an apples to apples comparison of employees that are as close as possible to one another, but one of whom use this intervention and follow them to see what the impact was.
So one thing that we run into is, say people get, you could take volunteers, right? But, your volunteers are probably your enthusiastic people. They might have higher CSAT scores to begin with. But let's say it's something like the wage, or maybe this class is seen as very desirable, and so you kind of can't exclude people. You offer it to the center, maybe, 60% of them opt in or whatever. So if you wanted to compare some of the non-users to the users, are there variables you could control for? Like, without getting too technical, what are some things you would do to make sure A and B are actually comparable groups if A is really just the enthusiasts?
Yeah, that's the challenge with what I was just describing, is that there's no way to account for motivation, right? The fact that someone just raised their hand and said yes means there may be something different about them than there is about the group that said no. However, there's still some approaches that we can, use to try to address that. And one is, let's minimize the differences between those two groups. In other words, for every person that raised their hand and said yes, can I identify someone in the control group, in the group that said no, that by appearances, by all their data, they seem to be as close as possible, right? And can we pair those two individuals up so that we're getting as close to as possible a view of the true intervention, and not that motivation effect that I mentioned earlier.
So maybe like you could do people who have the same supervisor, right? Because they're all effect, so you have an equal amount of effect. Or maybe people with the same KPI history, same CSAT scores, same average handle times, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, all of those are valid. Really, any data that you have available can be used to make a better propensity score. So I think, the key is if you can try to make them as close as possible. Now this whole exercise has been, let's hack away at all the different sources of variation that could be driving this change other than the CSAT class. And again, we're never going to get to the point where we can prove this the way we would in a laboratory. But when we start using the same location, it's a workplace. We have employees, and that's okay. We shouldn't be trying to treat them like they're lab rats, right? But the more that we can try to eliminate all these other sources of variation in the CSAT scores, the more that we're going to do a better job at isolating the true impact of this one class.
Okay, so say, for the CSAT class, let's bring it back to that. Let's say it's not, nobody cares if they have the CSAT class or not. You might actually be able to randomize who gets it. Is that also true? Then you actually would be able to test pretty with quite a bit of certainty.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say this, that if folks were pretty indifferent, and if I could enroll a certain number of people in the class and not enroll a certain number of people, and they would follow that recommendation, I would actually consider that to be the gold standard here, right? A true experimental design.
So you randomly enroll them. Basically the next best thing, it sounds like, is if there's the fact that the A and the B group are in the center is going to create some sort of cross problems. It makes sense to look at the people who want to do it and who don't want to do it, and take a subset of them who match, right? Who have similar KPIs or bosses or maybe demographics. And maybe you haven't perfectly answered motivation there, but honestly, if you have CSAT scores and average handle times, you're probably pretty close. And then at that point, you compare the two groups. Is that basically it? And see, does it help Group A versus Group B? Okay, so let's say the CSAT score starts at 4.5, and Group A, after the class, Group A, and we're they've been matched with the Group B people, ends at 4.7, and the Group B people stay at 4.5. Does that mean the class adds 0.2? Is it just simple subtraction at that point?
Yeah, I mean, well, it gets a little trickier than that when you're running like a regression and you want to control for a lot of different factors. But in all honesty, at first blush, doing that simple subtraction isn't far off. That's how I would at least get a sense of what the magnitude is.
Okay.
The true, again, I don't want to bog everyone down with the details. You'd run a multivariate regression and include variables in there that represent, all these other things that could influence someone's performance along with the intervention. That's the truer way to do it. But in all honesty, if you design the experiment in this way, you could do the simple math, and I wouldn't disbelieve that result, right? It might be off a little bit here or there, but at the end of the day, it'd be pretty close to the actual answer.
So why don't I ask the question a different way, but very similarly. So say that you can be pretty certain that your two groups are comparable, right? You randomize who gets it, nobody's upset, that sort of thing. You roll the class out to half the people, you don't to the other. You started at 4.5 CSAT, and the people who got the class go up to 4.7, and who didn't get the class go to 4.5. Do you have to do all that multivariate work, or is it just subtraction?
No, at that point, if we're talking randomized in the way that you mentioned, yeah, it's pretty simple math. It gets very simple at that point.
So it added basically 0.2. Let's keep that cleaner scenario and say, okay, well, if that's true, I can subtract, right? I could randomize who gets things as long as it doesn't create a bunch of problems. Or I have 20 centers, I could randomize which centers get it, maybe. What if you do the same thing? You go in and there's a CSAT improvement class, and the average is 4.5, for the both groups for the class, and after the people who took the class go down to 4.3, and the people who don't take the class go down to 4.1. That to me looks paradoxical, right? It looks like they added, by the math, 4.3 minus 4.1 means the CSAT score, the CSAT class improved by 0.2 for that group A, but then everything went down. So how does the CSAT score improve things if everything goes down?
Yeah, it's a great question, because that's the whole point of having this control group, because there's other things going on in the center. Maybe it was a hard month. Maybe it rained every day of the month, and as a result, everyone was in a grumpy mood. If we, that's why we have that control group as a baseline, right? So we know the fact that their scores in the aggregate went from 4.5 to 4.1 means that we would expect in that period of time the scores to drop by 0.4. Whereas for the group that got the intervention, it didn't drop by 0.4. It went from 4.5 to 4.3. That means that, they dropped in CSAT scores, but not as much as the control group. And so the good news is that's really why we do what we're doing here, so that we have this baseline to compare to. And you can say, no, the CSAT class actually produced an increase over and above what you would have experienced if you hadn't gone through the CSAT class and you had just dropped like the rest.
Awesome. So it still was a net contributor, even if there were other detractors that were bigger, and how much.
Exactly.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Okay. So then that accounts for all the other changes, right? So you can this is something that a lot of my clients ask me, okay, so you have an intervention, a control group, but there's so much that's swirling and going on. I mean, I think I can anticipate your answer now, but given a lot of what you said, but I want to come back to this because it's really a point of contention for a lot of people. We're just absorbing this new contact center into our operation, and we're bringing in new management. So it's not a good time to test something because we won't know what's driving the changes. It sounds like you can actually isolate the changes more or less no matter what else is going on. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. It's the same as the example we just talked about, which is there could be a lot of other things going on, but if you implement this experiment, this test in the right way, if you design it in the right way, you'll get a very high fidelity measure of the true impact of this class, regardless of what is going on around. And I like to emphasize that, the funny thing about econometrics, not to get on my sort of academic high horse, but the funny thing about econometrics is there are all these tools for handling situations where you can't design an experiment, right? We're given data after the fact. We have to come up with clever ways to handle it. But in a case like this where you're seeing through an intervention, you can design those conditions and you don't have to do, as all that sort of fancy math work. Exactly. Yeah. That's the dream. The only reason we do what we do as economists is because we rarely get the opportunity to say, you know what, let's test something out with part of the population.
Right. Yeah. Can you imagine convincing a president or something? Why don't we roll out this economic policy for, okay, fair enough. Yeah. That makes sense. So what about practical advice? Some of the words you've used are big, but I think you've really boiled it down well, which is, divide the group in half if you can. If it's not going to cause problems for the people who don't get the test, and then, compare how they do going forward. But there's still some, there were some of these cases that are on the edge where it might be hard to do that. And so you have to do some, making sure the variables match and all that kind of stuff. I think the practical question is, who in a call center is best positioned to do this? Are there internal resources that most call center operations people can turn to? Just for someone to say, like, hey, can you help me put this experiment together and measure the effect?
Yeah, it's hard business, no question. Just doing this right can be a challenge. That said, I found that there's almost always kind of internal business intelligence and analytics folks that are pretty strong when it comes to, understanding, just how to understand reporting and benchmarking and how to think about numbers. And so, my view is, that, hopefully you guys, everyone at Tenacity can help lend a helping hand.
Yeah, we definitely do with clients.
Yeah. But I also think that there are a lot of folks. I've always been surprised. We did a ton of work with call centers. Quite frankly, Evolve almost exclusively our client base was call centers. And there were always smart business analytics folks there to help us understand their data, to help us understand how we could get that data and how we could do reporting, things like that. So you just have to kind of know what doors to be knocking on.
Okay. So turn to those business intelligence, business analytics people, turn to maybe even your finance people, at least are a little not going to be as overwhelmed by the math. So if they have to learn something new, they can, it doesn't just feel like, oh my gosh, I'm back to school. It's good that you don't, it's good that you don't have to have a team of data scientists put this together. When I think about how important this is, it's one thing, you said, we help our clients because for us, measuring our effect is extremely important. We differentiate on the fact that we actually produce results, right? You find very few people in the call center world selling to the call center world that say that. They talk about their results, but they don't really double down on the and we'll prove it, right? Because nobody knows how to prove stuff. But to me, forget Tenacity for a second. To me, this is you're right. You can't treat people as lab rats. You can't have the perfect example. But right now, the sort of, I don't know, CSAT went up, to me feels not a whole lot better than rolling the dice. Maybe it's slightly better, rolling a slightly sticky die. But what you're talking about basically could help companies make decisions that could save them tens of millions of dollars. There's the CSAT improvement program, there's buying Tenacity or Evolve, but there's do we need what's this new business practice we're thinking about adopting, or this new supervisor to team member ratio, or all the stuff people think, should we try Taco Tuesdays or whatever, right? Or should we buy this new $100 million software program, and try the $10 million version across, half year. Anyway, it just seems to me like you could actually measure ROI this way, which is cool because everybody talks about ROI all the time, but if you don't know what's causing your effects, you can't know your ROI.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's super important. And, look, as an economist or just kind of someone who likes to use data to make decisions, you want to avoid we call type 1 or type 2 errors, false positives or false negatives. That means you're evaluating a program. The worst thing you can do is decide, okay, this wasn't a good program when it actually was, or the opposite. Right. And so really what all of these tools are meant to do is to help minimize the likelihood that one of those occurs. If Tenacity or Evolve or any other invention is really, really valuable, you want to make sure that you're picking up on that, right? And not passing up on a really valuable opportunity, right?
And it sounds like you could, depending on the circumstances, you could apply that to anything. You could apply it to hardware, you could apply it to software, could apply it to business practices. It's actually, the opportunities are endless to figure out how to spend your money better. That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, hey,
Absolutely.
I really appreciate this. I've spoken to a lot of call center people who are overwhelmed by this topic, and I think this will be actually a very direct, usable tool for a lot of them, or it will be the first step toward actually really just getting someone in their organization to design simple experiments that can save them millions potentially, or at least tens of thousands of dollars at the least. And so you have made the world a little bit better place today. Hopefully, a lot of people will get to see this and learn from it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.